if you read Egyptian cuneiform, which I'm sure you all do, in this stanza here, you can see that they're talking about this artifact. Next slide, please.
This artifact, if you look in many history books,
next slide, please.
Appears multiple times.
Next slide.
There we go.
Hey! Alright, so in Egyptian
Egyptian
mythology, you can see here this is a plunger, an ordinary plunger. Next slide, please.
It is also in Roman mythology.
This is the Roman goddess Jenna Pettigrew.
With plunger in hand, as you can see.
Next slide, please.
The plunger.
Right. Next slide,
History,
please.
Composition, and
Next slide,
application.
All right, so this was the prototype actually that it came forth from the inventor. Next slide. He designed it not with computer graphics because they didn't have that available in that day. Next slide. Using these complex physics, it was a really tough job. Next slide. So this was the inventor.
This is the founder, John Plunger.
They named it after him. Next slide.
John Plunger himself.
Next slide. So he had a dilemma. He was trying to figure out something. His head was cold and he had to put something on it. So he put on his thinking cap. Next slide. Like any sensible person would do. Next slide. He tried these things, but
they were just
I don't know,
too small, not powerful enough. So
next slide.
He tried something else.
And he tried just a cup alone, but he couldn't figure out how to pull it up. Next slide.
He tried the stick alone, but that didn't work. So being the smart man that John Plunger was,
next slide.
After seeing that failed, he combined the stick, the cup, and the glue to create your plunger.
Next slide. John Plunger actually went on to have a successful career, performing as you see him here in a tuxedo in plunger.
You can look him up in the yellow pages if you want to show. He won multiple awards.
His first gold plunger.
Golden plunger.
Next slide. The Academy plunger. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to teach you about the anatomy of a plunger. Most plungers, the traditional is mainly composed of two different parts. Next slide.
First, the cup.
And next?
The shaft.
Next slide. Now the modern plunger's got a little more complicated. Next slide. This has vacuum action.
Very rare.
Yeah,
I don't have one.
This was an intermediate model until they got to the next slide. So this one
is the granddaddy of them all.
It cost $1,573. I've been saving up since I was 5. As you can see, there's a purge valve on, off. The time
it has a laser cutter right there in case you have dense
deposits
that you can just cut. Also cleans very well.
I like the depth gauge personally, 239 meters.
Very helpful. Don't want to get below 230.
Next slide.
230 is bad.
Okay, so this was when I was having fun. You're always in those school presentations, and you want to put in those cool little effects, but they won't let you. So I got to do it here. Different varieties. Next slide. This is the standard.
What everyone has.
They used the standard for bowling ball relays, as shown here. Next slide.
This is the flange, an alternative model of the plunger.
It's a great cultural icon, especially this one where you can make it look like a top hat. Next slide. Now, this one is for those hard to reach places.
This one is a beauty. You see how tall the shaft is. You can really get leverage to use it well.
Now, I know this may be kind of hard for all of you to learn and take in at once, but don't get mad. Next slide. Next slide. For those household problems, you have the small plunger.
The sink ones.
Next.
The travel size plunger. Just stick it in that travel carry-on.
Next.
Golden.
Now, we didn't really know what this one was for. It looked like some sort of alien plungers. I don't know what an alien toilet looks like, but next slide. This is another variation of it, but we did figure out it eventually. Mm-hmm. Next slide. It's a lantern.
So not a plunger, a lantern. Could be used as a plunger though.
Next slide. Don't forget the plunger gun.
Classic Christmas present. Got it when I was 5 years old. Still have it.
Next slide. Now this was actually very interesting. The plunger is a great cultural icon. Next slide. And next. influencing art all over the world. Next slide, please. And music, actually. This was the most interesting of our discoveries. Next slide. Next slide.
You can see here on the end, they have the plunger cups right there
Next
to
slide.
help them play.
I hope you remember what
The
that
cup.
is called. Next slide. In mythology, next slide. John Plunger was said to have basically created, culturally, the next slide.
Unicorn.
Next slide, please. This is a mountain in Alaska. It's named the Plunger. I'm not joking. You see those two men up there? They call it the Plunger for one reason.
Wonder how they got up there.
Next slide. Next slide, please. It also is a very trendy tool.
A lot of you are embarrassed about using a plunger, but Moraga moms also use the plunger.
Next slide. You can get many stylish varieties to fit you Berkeley people. Next slide.
Wind chimes.
Next slide.
Useful.
For protests. Next slide. Anytime you have a household problem, missing a hand,
Very handy.
use the plunger.
The plunger is a handyman in itself. Also, the stick shift in a car.
Next slide. On playgrounds. It's very nice. Next slide, please. As a fashion accessory, I would recommend this to any of you who are bald, balding, or shave your heads. Next slide, please.
Also helps on the subway rides. You know, the subway rides can get long and tiresome. Just plop a plunger behind you, put the hat on, and you're good for a couple hours.
All right, thank you. That is Plunger's